Blade & Sorcery is a VR classic, but even with its many updates over the last 5 years, it's never really been a game. Now what I mean by that is while it has always been incredibly fun to play, at no point was there any sort of lore to follow or objective to progress towards. And for that reason, I've always found it difficult to stick with this game, other than to occasionally admire its impressive combat mechanics. However, this all changes with the 1.0 version and its Crystal Hunt campaign mode. But is it worth coming back for? And for first time players, does it warrant the increased asking price? Let's take a look and find out. But first, let me try to explain what Crystal Hunt is and what it is not. This is a progression mode. There is a goal you'll be attempting to reach, but it is not a story mode, at least in the traditional sense. So while you can find notes around the levels that add to the game's overall lore, there aren't any cutscenes, missions, or characters outside of the shopkeeper. Instead, what you'll be doing in Crystal Hunt is completing procedurally generated outposts, fighting in arenas, and after earning a couple of scrolls, taking on Dalgarian dungeons. These reward you with currency that can be spent on better gear, and crystals which are used to upgrade your magical powers. Now I can understand if this familiar gameplay loop is disappointing to those wanting something a bit more narrative, but even though it doesn't break the mold, I think it does a really good job of taking advantage of the game's strengths. And I'd much prefer something like this over what could have been an unoriginal and heavy-handed story. What this does do is give purpose to what had previously been an enjoyable but directionless game. No longer are you pointlessly taking on wave after wave of enemies, but now you're working towards a goal and getting stronger and stronger while you're at it. And you're motivated to do so by the endlessly entertaining and rewarding combat. I'm sure you've seen plenty of clips of the insane and brutal actions that you can pull off in this game, but after this update, it's never been better. Everything feels polished and cohesive, and you're given plenty of options as to how you approach combat. Fight with swords, axes, bows, multiple disciplines of magic, other people, chickens, and so much more. The possibilities are almost endless, and you can switch back and forth between all of them because you aren't locked into any particular class. This variety is also present in the game's enemies. They do have access to nearly all of the tools as the player and will not hesitate to throw you across the map, meaning occasionally they can pose a very real threat, making it even more satisfying as you give them a taste of your aerial takedown. Blade & Sorcery has always been an excellent physics playground, but with this update, all of the incredible feats that you can pull off finally have a purpose. After defeating an arena of enemies or conquering an outpost, you're rewarded with either gold or valuables which can be traded in at the Baron's Bounty, an incredibly immersive environment where you physically browse and purchase items. This area is a perfect example of just how much these developers understand virtual reality. You can rough up the shopkeeper, try out his wares, and just inhabit the world as a physical presence. And without any obtrusive leveling systems or forced RPG mechanics, it does a great job of rewarding you in a uniquely immersive way. But I understand not everyone is as depressingly obsessed as I am with getting a slightly shinier sword, so I'll move on to something a bit more substantial, and that is the newly introduced Dalgarian dungeons. And while they do follow a similar structure to the outposts, they bring with them the introduction of boss fights, or rather boss fights, because as far as I can tell, there is just one that's repeated at the end of each and every dungeon. It definitely got more difficult each time, but the lack of variety in this regard is pretty disappointing. But what isn't disappointing is the actual boss fight itself. It's the first time we've gotten to fight a non-human enemy, and wow is it different. What it reminds me of most is a boss from something like Dragon's Dogma 2, as you're required to scale its appendages to attack weak points. The whole experience is just monumental, even when you're doing it for the 6th time. With the release of its Crystal Hunt progression mode, Blade & Sorcery is finally complete, now featuring a satisfying gameplay loop that kept me coming back to its endlessly enjoyable and evolving combat, as well as stunning visuals that bring to life its expansive procedurally generated outposts and dungeons. While it can get a little repetitive, if you enjoy the game's mechanics, I think it's worth seeing through to the end. And for newcomers, there's never been a better time to play what is now one of the best virtual reality titles ever made.